got a list of the plus periods that we have left after D-Day, or I mean before D-Day, leading up to D-Day. So I'm a little bit put off today because I've had third period and sixth period and had students who don't know what NATO is, or they don't know what the Marshall Plan is. Hey, you got to decide either you're in or you're not. This test is going to be the hardest U.S. history test you've ever seen in your life. You have to master the top tens. You have to put in some time to prepare yourself. You got to know something. If you don't know anything, you're going to get waxed. If you don't know the top tens, you're going to get annihilated. I'm just telling you. Maybe that'd be a good experience for you. I don't know. But there's still time. There's still, what, 12 days? A couple hours a day for 12 days could make a huge difference. But you got to decide. Don't dilly-dally. You're either in, you're committed to preparing yourself to know something for this test, or just go golfing that day. I mean, it might be a nice day, right? Now, on Friday, I was gone. On Thursday, we were talking about the resurgence of conservatism, and that development took place in the Ronald Reagan presidency. So let me just review some of the big ideas there. Reagan championed free market capitalism. So basically he said we need to put away regulation of companies. We need to loosen them from these regulations. We need to put the dampers on labor unions. And we need to let this economy loose. So that's basically going back to the 1920s and Harding, Coolidge, Hoover type of policies. But he also came to power because he rode a wave of social conservatism. So anti-gay rights, anti-loose morals, anti-abortion, anti-feminism, reactions to the civil rights movement. Essentially, this decade of the 1960s, where you had the sexual and cultural revolution, this resurgence of conservatism, it has a component of evangelical and fundamental Christians in it called the moral majority, and they're highly motivated on social issues. So Reagan, for example, is the first one to turn the South red. Right? Prior to the 1970s, the South would vote Democratic. They called it the Solid South because it always supported the Democratic candidate, but they supported Reagan. And it's pretty much been Republican ever since Ronald Reagan, the South, the old Confederacy. So the conservatism has kind of two prongs to it, economic and social. And I think over time, like the conservatism today, it's become more emphasis of social and less emphasis of economics. So, you know, Reagan cut taxes, they attacked labor unions, they gave the wealthy cuts on the estate tax. And what has happened since the 1970s, one of our major trends is this widening gap between rich and poor, and the, you know, carving up of the middle class. The middle class has been shrinking since this time period, and it's tied to these policies. So those are the things we were talking about on Thursday. What questions do you have about it? Skillfully mobilized and led conservative crusade, depicted big government as the villain, populist message condemned federal intervention in local affairs, and recruited working class Democrats on social issues. Also tough, harshly anti-Soviet. Questioned liberal welfare programs and affirmative action. Championed traditional family values. questions about this resurgence of conservatism? Okay, then let's shift to foreign policy. This is not easy to do because it sort of requires an understanding of what happened between Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan, right? It's an evolution, they're connected. But Reagan is still very much in the jaws of the Cold War. I don't know if you know this, but Khrushchev was the Soviet leader during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Khrushchev was the one that said, let's go ahead and put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And then that crisis, Khrushchev was the one who backed down. It really wasn't Kennedy who backed down, it was Khrushchev. They withdrew the missiles. And so Khrushchev lost his seat as the leader of the Soviet Union because he backed down from the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he was replaced by a hardliner named Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev oversaw the biggest military defense buildup in Soviet history. By 1980, the Soviets had more nuclear weapons than the United States. They had bigger air force. They had more men in their military. They had more of everything. They completely sacrificed their consumer society for military and space, and they had eclipsed the United States. In 1980, they invaded Afghanistan, and basically the Cold War gets a breath of vigor to it. Do you guys know the term détente? That's French, means relaxation of tensions. So the Cold War kind of, it's hard to play with the words because you say it heated up. Well, it's a Cold War. Then they say it cooled off. You can get confused about what's it doing. Is it getting hotter or colder? But anyway, period of relaxation of tensions came in the 70s under Nixon. Of course, Nixon and his Secretary of State Kissinger visited China. They drank champagne with Mao Zedong. They also visited with Brezhnev. So there's these summits between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 70s. But in 1980, the game is back on, and Reagan starts anteing up the rhetoric. Well, one of the things he did that's a part of this strategy is Reagan initiated some of the biggest defense budget increases in American history. So the 1980s, your textbook says the U.S. expenditures on the military in the 1980s made the New Deal look stingy. So they pumped $2 trillion into the military in the 1980s. And that was a part of Reagan's formula for defeating the Soviets. Now, it kind of fell into his hands because in 1985, Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he introduced two things. One is called perestroika, and one is called glasnost. And I can't remember which one comes first, but glasnost means openness. So let's let people have freedom of speech. If they want to criticize the government, we're not doing there's actually a story of Gorbachev was in his motorcade, in his big long car in Moscow, and he got a flat tire. And his aides went everywhere they could in Moscow to these mechanics, and all of them had left the state-run garage to go over and do their private mechanic to make money. And so he couldn't even get his tire fixed on his motorcade. And that's the example he used when he told the Russian people, our government is not cutting it if the head of state can't get his tire fixed in Moscow. Then something's not working. And he kind of has a point, doesn't he? And the reason he couldn't get it fixed is because all the mechanics left their state-run job and went over on the side and did side work to make some cash to be able to buy groceries. So he said, we need to let the Russian people criticize the government and its inefficiencies and tolerate people if they want to practice religious faith, for example, openness. But then restructuring, he said we need to introduce profit motive and allow people some private ownership of business to make a profit. Otherwise, our economy is just getting, it's getting annihilated. We can't compete. So once you open the floodgates, once Gorbachev opened the floodgates, you know, it was only 3 or 4 years after he introduced glasnost and perestroika, the Berlin Wall came down. Because the Eastern European countries saw what Gorbachev was saying, and they're like, hey, okay, that's all we needed to know. In the early 80s, there was a movement in Poland under a leader named Lech Walesa, and it was called Solidarity. And basically there's an underground movement against Polish communist government, which was undermining communism in Poland. And I think Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, there were rumblings of, even Hungary, there were rumblings of trying to overthrow. So that's one major thing that happens during Reagan's foreign policy, during Reagan's term, is you're watching the devolution of the Soviet Union, you're watching the crumbling of communism, and it crumbles all across. Once the Berlin Wall came down in the fall of '89, revolution rippled through Eastern Europe, and it toppled all of the communist governments in Eastern Europe. And by '91, the Soviet Union voted itself out of existence. Questions about that? Reagan is given credit, and to some extent it's fair that he get the credit, because he was challenging the status quo in the Soviet Union. He went to Berlin and he said, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Well, if the President of the United States says something in the international arena, the whole world hears it, right? It's not a coincidence that in 1989, the year that the wall came down, is the same year that we got the Tiananmen Square. Did Tiananmen Square happen in '89 or '90?
It's 89, I think.
The summer of '89. And that fall, the Berlin Wall came down. So communism around the world is shaky. As you get to the end, well, Reagan's left by '89. Okay, then there's a bunch of other smaller foreign policy issues. Israel started building houses in the West Bank. If you don't know what that means, yeah, I don't know if I want to go back all the way through the Arab-Israeli peace process. Show me your hand if you got a basic understanding of it in world studies, the Arab-Israeli peace. So Israel was created in 1948, but it was created to be two states, Palestine and Israel. And there would be a Muslim and a Jewish state, essentially. And a war ensued the day after Israel declared itself independent, and the U.S. sided with Israel by recognizing them. And basically Israel took much of the territory that the other Muslim nation was going to get. And so that other nation, Palestine, was never really organized. But those Arab people were concentrated in certain parts of Israel. And so during Reagan's term, what the Israeli government is doing is sponsoring the construction of houses for Jewish people in territory that had been designated to be in the Palestinian state. So Israel also invaded Lebanon in 1982, Lebanon was in a civil war, there was a terrorist attack on U.S. Marines barracks in Lebanon in 1983. So a terrorist took a truckload of explosives and he drove through a barricade and he drove right into a United States Marines barracks and killed 200 U.S. Marines in Lebanon in 1983. So that's kind of terrorism a la 1983. But Reagan had put them there more or less in support of Israel. And after this event, he withdrew the U.S. Marines because he just said the cost is too high of leaving our Marines vulnerable to terrorist attacks. But that was quite a shock to Americans at the time, that 200 U.S. Marines got killed. Nicaragua, do you guys know what a Sandinista is? Or Iran-Contra scandal? Anybody familiar with those two? All right, well, let's start with Nicaragua. That's a hard one to start with as well. The United States has a history from this period of using its CIA to instigate coups in countries to get rid of a communist in order to install someone who's friendly to United States business and to United States government. And so the United States did that in 1954 in Guatemala, and they did it in 1953 in Iran. So basically you use your CIA and you secretly undermine the government in the country to get rid of the guy you don't want to get the guy that you do want. And that had happened, and by the 1980s, people around the world knew that the U.S. had done this. So you've got, in Nicaragua, you get a communist takeover, and the U.S. had backed a brutal dictator in Nicaragua named Somoza. And Anastasio Somoza. So he had been a long-time dictator, and what happened around 1980 is communists called the Sandinistas overthrew the American-backed dictator in Nicaragua. So you're starting to get the picture. There was a US-backed dictator in Nicaragua for quite some time, and then communists overthrew him in the early 1980s. And so now you've got a communist dictator shaking his fist at Reagan. So what Reagan wants to do is fund Contras. That's a Spanish word meaning rebels or opposition. And they're based in El Salvador, which borders Nicaragua. So he wants to fund these rebels who are going to overthrow the communist government in Nicaragua. Does that make sense? Congress says no. We ain't doing that. Because that's kind of how we started the Vietnam War. So Congress says no. So what Reagan did is he used his national security advisor and a few people, and they secretly sold some old weapons to Iran, took the money, and funded the Contras, even though Congress had said they shouldn't do that. Now, none of this came out until the late 80s, as Reagan was just about to leave office. And Reagan never really did get in much trouble over it. He was forced to answer questions, but at the time, Alzheimer's was starting to take over Ronald Reagan. Like by '89, it was apparent that Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's. And so when he said, "I don't remember," he actually maybe didn't remember. You know, that's what they say now when they call these Trump appointees up and they start grilling them. They say, "I don't recall, I don't remember, I can't remember, I don't recall." They say it about 50 times because they don't want to answer the question. But when Reagan said it, it's possible that he really didn't remember. but we know that he had okayed it, and so those Contras were funded with. Now the really embarrassing side of it is they sold old American weapons to Iran. Well, Iran is historically, since the revolution of '79, America's nemesis or enemy. So they said funding the Contras is more important to us than if the Iranians get weapons. Did you know Iran and Iraq fought a 10-year war in the 1970s? I think 1 million died on each side, Iran and Iraq. Who did the U.S. support? Somebody say something. The U.S. supported one side. Who did the U.S. support? Iraq. Yes, Iraq. Because they thought it would be better to keep restraints on Iran, which was pretty much run by Muslim fundamentalists and had been sponsors of what the U.S. considered terrorists. So when they supported Saddam Hussein, they were really creating a future enemy. What did I say? Nicaragua, and the other one is Iran. Iran-Contras. Did I explain both of those questions about Nicaragua or? So there's a Ronald Reagan scandal for selling weapons to Iran secretly, getting the money and funding the Contras when Congress told him don't do that. Any questions?
Did anyone take the blame?
Yeah, Oliver North, Reagan's national security advisor, took the fall for it. I think he went to prison for, I don't know, less than 5 years. He was pretty young at the time. He's now kind of a loony bin. Oliver North, you ever heard his name recently? He's kind of one of those wow out there. Do you guys have any questions about Ronald Reagan? Domestic or foreign? This is what I have in my notes, Reagan's economic legacy. He did ease many regulatory rules and restrictions. He did push through major tax reforms. He drastically increased U.S. military spending. He created huge deficits. So really the beginning of the modern United States debt problem starts in the 1980s when the U.S. government starts running deficits. And the vice president to George W. Bush is a guy named Dick Cheney. And he was the Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. And he famously said, deficits don't matter. Ronald Reagan proved that. So when he was vice president, he said that about two decades earlier. Daniel?
Didn't he use supply side for a while when he got criticized?
Ronald Reagan's economic policies are supply side because you're essentially saying we're going to cut taxes for the rich, and that's going to cause job creation. That's going to cause stimulus to the economy.
Is that kind of like trickle down then?
Trickle down and supply side and Reaganomics are all three references to the same thing. So one point, and this is more of a development, Reagan and the Republican followers, I don't know if you remember this last week, but I said one of the reasons Reagan is so important is because pretty much all Republican ideology or policy from 1980 on, Reagan is the architect of it. I mean, they're still saying Medicare costs too much, we don't have enough money for it. We need to cut taxes for the rich because that's what's gonna stimulate the economy. And these doggone entitlements cost too much, and we gotta cut those back. Those are coming from Ronald Reagan. So the way it's worked is, Bill Clinton actually made this point, but if you go back and look at when the deficits get bigger and when they get smaller, deficits grow the most under Republican presidents and Republican Congresses, and they grow the least under Democratic Congresses. But everybody thinks the opposite. Everybody thinks the Republicans are the ones who restrain spending because they're always saying, we gotta cut spending. But like this current President Trump, they just passed a budget that increased the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars. And at the same time, they cut taxes. Well, if you cut taxes, you're cutting the revenue of the government. And if you overspend, you're ballooning the deficit. Do you guys know the difference between a deficit and a debt?
Deficit is year, and then debt is accumulation of deficit.
So if you have a deficit of 100 billion in 82 and 150 billion in 83 and 180 billion in 84, you got to add all that up as your debt. Deficit is the amount you overspend in the year. The debt is the accumulation of the amount that you overspend, right? So that's how you got to $20 trillion debt, is deficit spending. But by the end of the Obama administration, the deficit was zero. Is that right? No, by the end of the Clinton administration, the deficit was zero. Now, part of that is because Clinton, the economy boomed. You had the dot-com technology, microcomputer software boom of the economy in the 1990s, and so a lot of jobs were created, and then that causes revenue to the US government to increase. That helped, right? If you have more revenue, it's gonna help not have a deficit. But the deficit got to zero in 2000, and then 9/11 happened, and the war on terror, and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the economy went south in 2003, and it crashed in 2008. So those 10 years from 2000 to 2010, you started a war in two countries, you got attacked by terrorists, and the economy went south. You had a housing crash. What questions do you have? I think we have a minute, because I really talked about a lot of stuff.
Isn't the majority of the debt owed to people in the United States still? So
Anybody who purchases a US Treasury bond,
isn't that like 40% of the debt?
yeah, I mean, China's government owns a lot of US Treasury. I'm trying to help you see the complexity of it. Every country on earth probably has holders of US Treasury bonds, but you might be right. You might be right that the US population owns 40% of it, but that means 60% of it is owned by people outside the United States. So